He was carrying the heir to a billion-dollar empire, yet he was freezing on a New York sidewalk selling bruised roses for $3 apiece. Just glass and steel separated a desperate pregnant Omega from the ruthless Alpha who ruined his life and didn't even know he existed. The wind howling down Liberty Street was unforgiving, slicing through the thin frayed material of Alex Finch's oversized military surplus jacket. It was late November in Manhattan, and the biting cold was a cruel companion to the aching weight in his lower back. At 23, Alex was 6 months pregnant, completely broke, and utterly alone. He stood near a steaming subway grate, clutching a plastic bucket filled with day-old carnations and slightly bruised white roses. He had bought them wholesale from Hector, a sympathetic bodega owner in Queens, spending his last $20 in a desperate gamble to make enough for rent and the cheap over-the-counter scent blockers he desperately needed. In the Omegaverse, an unbonded pregnant Omega on the streets was a target. The blockers, though nauseating and rough on his system, masked his natural sweet scent of warm vanilla and white peach, replacing it with a sterile, chalky chemical odor that kept predatory alphas at bay. Alex adjusted his thick wool scarf, pulling it up to his freezing nose, and cast his gaze upward. Towering above him was the monolithic glass structure of Aegis Capital Holdings. Inside those walls, surrounded by Italian leather mahogany and millions of dollars, was Dominic Reed. Dominic. The name alone sent a sharp, involuntary pang through Alex's chest, making his baby kick violently against his ribs. He instinctively wrapped a frozen, fingerless, gloved hand over his swollen belly, murmuring a soft, soothing hum to calm the distressed pup. Less than a year ago, Alex had been a bright-eyed, ambitious junior analyst at a struggling tech firm. He had his life planned out, pay off his student loans, climb the corporate ladder, and maybe eventually find a gentle alpha to build a life with. Then Aegis Capital had initiated a hostile takeover. Dominic Reed, a 30-year-old apex alpha and the ruthless CEO of Aegis, had walked into their office like a god of war, all sharp jawlines, tailored Tom Ford suits, and an overwhelming, intoxicating scent of crushed cedar and sharp thunderstorms. Their collision had been an accident of biology and terrible timing. Alex had been working late in the archives room when Dominic, touring the facility, had suddenly dropped into a stress-induced premature rut. The sheer force of Dominic's pheromones had triggered Alex's own latent heat. It was supposed to be impossible. Omegas had heat suppressants, alphas had rut stabilizers. But true mates, the kind spoken of only in medical anomalies and old folklore, could bypass all chemical barriers. For 3 days they had been locked in Dominic's private penthouse at the plaza. It was a blur of tangled sheets, desperate whispers, and an all-consuming fire. Dominic had treated him with a possessive reverence, murmuring promises against Alex's skin, claiming him in every way, except for the final mating bite. But reality had crashed down on the 4th morning. Alex had awakened alone in the massive, cold bed. In place of the alpha who had held him so tenderly, there was Richard Dominic's cold-eyed chief operating officer. "Mr. Reed apologizes for the biological inconvenience," Richard had said, dropping a thick legal document and a check for $200,000 onto the nightstand. "He considers this a lapse in judgment. Sign the non-disclosure agreement. Take the money. If you try to contact him, Aegis Capital will ensure you never work in this city or any other ever again." Alex's pride, fierce and unbroken at the time, had flared. He had torn the check into pieces, thrown it at Richard's feet, and walked out of the hotel with nothing but his dignity. He had truly believed he could just move on. He hadn't known about the baby then. When the morning sickness started weeks later, Alex's world unraveled. He was fired from his new job for missing too many days. His landlord in Brooklyn evicted him when his savings ran dry. Desperation pushed him into the shadows, living in a cramped, unheated sublet in Queens, rationing instant noodles and cheap prenatal vitamins. Now standing outside the very building where the father of his child reigned, supreme, Alex wasn't here to beg. He was here because the financial district was crawling with wealthy executives who, driven by guilt or affairs, easily handed over $20 bills for a single rose without asking for change. It was a humiliating survival tactic, but when your pup's life is on the line, pride is the first thing to freeze to death. "Flowers!" Alex called out, his voice hoarse against the wind. "Fresh roses, $5. A group of junior brokers in sharp suits walked past, deliberately avoiding eye contact. One of them snickered, muttering something about the trash littering the sidewalk. Alex flinched, biting the inside of his cheek to keep the tears at bay. His inner Omega whined a pathetic, wounded sound that echoed in his mind. It craved a nest. It craved safety. Most of all, it craved the scent of thunderstorms and cedar. He rubbed his belly again. Just a few more hours, he promised the baby silently. Just enough for a hot meal and the electric bill. Above him on the 60th floor, Dominic Reed stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of his corner office, staring down at the city like a king surveying a kingdom he didn't even want. Dominic rubbed his temples, a dull, unrelenting migraine pulsing behind his eyes. His office was a sanctuary of wealth, soundproofed against the chaotic symphony of New York, yet he felt entirely on edge. His inner alpha was restless, pacing the confines of his mind with a low, agitated growl that hadn't ceased for 6 months. "Dominic, are you even listening?" The sharp, aristocratic voice broke through his brooding. Dominic turned to see Gabriel Montgomery, sitting gracefully on the white leather sofa. Gabriel was a stunning high-society Omega, the heir to Montgomery shipping. He was pristine, wrapped in cashmere, and smelled perfectly of expensive, synthetic lavender and cold champagne. They were engaged to be married in 2 months, a strategic merger, disguised as a society wedding. "I heard you, Gabriel," Dominic said, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that commanded immediate respect. "The caterers for the reception. You prefer the squab over the venison. Handle it. That's what my black card is for." Gabriel sighed, crossing his legs. "You've been completely absent lately, Dom. Even your pheromones are sour. If I didn't know better, I'd think you were pining for a lost mate." Dominic's jaw clenched. A lost mate. The memory of wide, terrified, yet deeply defiant hazel eyes flashed in his mind. The scent of warm vanilla and white peach. The boy from the archive room. Alex. Dominic had woken up that morning at the plaza, with a blinding fever, his rut breaking suddenly and violently requiring immediate medical intervention. When he had finally regained consciousness in a private hospital wing 2 days later, Alex was gone. Richard had informed Dominic that the Omega had demanded money, taken a large payout, and vanished, leaving behind a signed NDA. Richard had painted Alex as a calculated opportunist who had deliberately triggered Dominic's rut to secure a payday. Dominic's pride had been wounded. His alpha had felt betrayed. He had buried himself in work, orchestrating the Montgomery merger to force his instincts to settle. But they never did. Every night his dreams were haunted by soft skin, gasping breaths, and a phantom bond that ached like an amputated limb. "I have a board meeting," Dominic lied, grabbing his tailored wool overcoat. "I'll have my driver take you back to your townhouse." "We were supposed to have lunch," Gabriel protested, but Dominic was already out the door. He needed air. He needed to escape the suffocating sterility of his own life. Down on the street level, the lunch rush had begun. Alex's toes were completely numb inside his worn boots. He had managed to sell 4 roses, $20. It was a victory, however small. He bent down to retrieve a dropped carnation, his heavy belly throwing him off balance. He stumbled slightly, catching himself against the cold stone of the building's facade. "Watch it, street rat!" A harsh voice barked. A bicycle courier rushing to make a delivery clipped the edge of Alex's plastic bucket. The bucket tipped over with a sickening splash, sending icy water, and the remainder of Alex's fragile inventory, spilling across the unforgiving concrete. No. Alex dropped to his knees, ignoring the sharp pain in his back. He scrambled frantically over the wet pavement, his bare, freezing fingers trying to gather the crushed roses before the heavy boots of pedestrians trampled them completely. The automatic revolving doors of Aegis Capital Holdings spun smoothly, and Dominic Reed stepped out onto Liberty Street, flanked by 2 massive private security guards. The crisp winter air hit Dominic's face, but beneath the smell of exhaust, roasted nuts from a nearby cart, and cold pavement, something else struck him. It was incredibly faint, buried under layers of harsh chemical scent blockers, but Dominic's breath hitched. His alpha slammed against the forefront of his mind, practically roaring. Distress. Omega. Ours. Dominic stopped dead in his tracks. "Wait," he commanded, holding up a hand. His security detail halted instantly. Dominic's piercing blue eyes scanned the crowded sidewalk. Through the sea of grey and black coats, he saw a figure huddled on the ground near the curb. The person was wearing a hideous, oversized green jacket, frantically scooping up crushed flowers from a puddle of freezing water. "So your car is waiting," one of the guards muttered, gesturing to the sleek black Maybach idling at the curb. Dominic ignored him. Driven by an instinct he couldn't control, he stepped away from the safety of his detail and moved toward the shivering figure. Alex was crying. He couldn't help it. The hormones, the cold, the sheer humiliation of kneeling in a puddle of dirty water over $20 worth of ruined flowers broke him. He picked up a mangled white rose, a sob tearing from his throat. Suddenly, the bustling noise of the street seemed to mute. A shadow fell over him, blocking out the pale winter sun. Before he could look up, a scent hit him. It wasn't faint. It was an overwhelming, terrifyingly familiar wave of crushed cedar and the sharp electric ozone of a thunderstorm. It was a scent that commanded obedience, wrapped in an aggressive layer of protective anger. Alex's heart stopped. The baby kicked so hard he gasped. He froze his wide hazel eyes, slowly trailing up from the polished, custom-made Oxford shoes, up the impeccably tailored dark trousers, up the charcoal wool coat, until he met the face of his nightmares and his deepest, most shameful cravings. Dominic stood over him, perfectly still. The alpha's chest was heaving beneath his tailored suit, his eyes dilated, the irises nearly swallowed by black. He looked at the kneeling boy, then at the bruised flowers, and finally his gaze locked onto the swollen curve of Alex's belly, partially hidden but undeniable beneath the wet, clinging fabric of the open surplus jacket. Time evaporated. The city around them faded into a blur. "Alex!" Dominic breathed the name, slipping from his lips like a prayer he had forgotten he knew. The cold arrogance of the billionaire CEO vanished, replaced by a raw, devastating shock. Alex panicked. Pure instinctual terror seized him. He remembered Richard's threat. "If you try to contact him, Aegis Capital will ensure you never work in this city." If Dominic found out about the baby, a billionaire, Alpha wouldn't let a street rat raise his heir. He would take the baby. He would take the only thing Alex had left. "Don't touch me!" Alex screamed, scrambling backward on his hands and knees, ignoring the scrape of concrete against his palms. He shoved himself up, abandoning the bucket, abandoning the flowers, and bolted down the crowded sidewalk, his hand clutching his pregnant belly as he fled into the labyrinth of New York City. Dominic lunged forward, the polished leather of his custom Oxford shoes slipping slightly on the icy wet concrete. Alex Waite. His voice was a visceral roar, stripping away the refined veneer of the billionaire CEO and leaving only the desperate, frantic alpha beneath. But the crowded sidewalks of Liberty Street were a chaotic, shifting maze of tourists, stockbrokers, and street vendors. By the time Dominic shoved past a group of startled pedestrians, ignoring their indignant shouts, the oversized green surplus jacket had vanished into the subterranean depths of the Wall Street subway station. Dominic stood at the top of the stairwell, his chest heaving, the freezing wind whipping his dark hair across his forehead. His inner alpha was tearing at the edges of his sanity, thrashing against his ribs with a violence that made him physically ill. The scent warm vanilla and white peach, now heavily laced with the sour, acrid tang of absolute terror, lingered just enough to torment him. And the belly. Dominic's breath hitched, turning to white mist in the freezing air. He had seen the unmistakable swell beneath that worn coat. 6 months. It had been exactly 6 months since that catastrophic, heat-fevered weekend at the plaza. He spun around, his blue eyes blazing with a dangerous, lethal fury. The 2 massive private security guards stepped back instinctively, recognizing the lethal shift in their employer's posture. "Get the car!" Dominic snarled, his voice dropping to a terrifying, deadly register. Now, 10 minutes later, Dominic stormed through the polished mahogany doors of the executive suite at Aegis Capital Holdings. The air in the room seemed to immediately drop 10 degrees. Assistants scrambled out of his path, sensing the predatory aura radiating from him. He didn't stop until he kicked open the heavy glass door to the chief operating officer's office. Richard sat behind his desk, holding a crystal tumbler of scotch, looking over a quarterly report. He glanced up, an arrogant smirk playing on his lips, but it vanished the second he saw Dominic's face. "Dominic, what is—" Dominic crossed the room in 3 massive strides. He grabbed Richard by the lapels of his Armani suit and violently hurled the older alpha against the floor-to-ceiling window. The thick glass shuddered under the impact. "Where is the file, Richard?" Dominic's voice was a low, terrifying growl, his forearm pressed mercilessly against Richard's throat. "The file from the plaza." "The boy." Richard's face drained of color, his eyes wide with sudden panic. I don't know what you're talking about." "I handled it, Dominic. I paid him the $200,000, just like we discussed. He signed the NDA." "You're lying," Dominic whispered, the scent of crushed cedar and ozone flooding the room suffocatingly heavy. "I saw him today. On the street. Selling garbage out of a bucket. He is wearing rags. And he is carrying my child." Richard choked his hands, futilely clawing at Dominic's iron grip. "He's a con artist. He probably blew the money, I swear on my life." "Dominic." "Arthur." Dominic roared, not breaking eye contact with his terrified COO. "Arthur." Dominic's head of private security, and a stoic, heavily scarred beta, stepped immediately into the office, locking the door behind him. "Tear his accounts apart," Dominic ordered, finally dropping Richard to the floor like a piece of worthless trash. Every offshore shell company, every hidden asset. Trace the $200,000 from 6 months ago. While Arthur immediately pulled out his encrypted tablet, Dominic paced the room like a caged apex predator. It only took 4 minutes. 4 minutes for the entire house of cards to collapse. "Sir," Arthur spoke quietly, holding up the screen. The check was never cashed by Alex Finch. The funds were rerouted 3 days later into a Cayman Islands account registered under a dummy corporation. The sole signatory is Richard Davies. Silence descended upon the office, thick and suffocating. Richard scrambled backward, his back pressed against the glass, realizing there was no escape. "Dominic, please listen to me. You were out of your mind. A street-level Omega from the archives. It would have ruined the Montgomery merger. I did it to protect the firm. I told him you were disgusted by him. I told him you'd destroy his life if he ever came near you." The realization hit Dominic like a physical blow. The absolute betrayal. While Dominic had been drowning in guilt and a phantom bond, believing Alex had sold him out, Alex had been threatened, silenced, and thrown onto the streets, pregnant and entirely alone. "Arthur." Dominic said, his voice terrifyingly calm, devoid of all emotion. "Call the federal authorities, hand over the embezzlement files, and ensure Mr. Davies is utterly ruined. I want him to spend the rest of his pathetic life behind bars." As Richard began to sob and beg, Dominic turned and walked out of the office. He had a mate to find. Across the city, in the decaying, shadowed depths of a Queen's apartment building, Alex fumbled with his keys, his hands shaking violently. His scent blockers had completely failed, washed away by the puddle water and his own sweat. He smelled strongly of distressed vanilla and fear. He finally pushed the splintering wooden door open, collapsing into the freezing, windowless shoebox of an apartment. There was no heating. The walls were covered in peeling yellow wallpaper, and the only furniture was a stained mattress on the floor. Alex slid down the wall, clutching his belly, his breath coming in ragged, painful gasps. The baby was restless, reacting to the massive spike in Alex's stress hormones. Shh, it's okay." Alex wept, rocking back and forth on the cold linoleum floor. "I'm sorry, pup. I'm so sorry." He had seen Dominic. The alpha's eyes had locked onto him with a terrifying intensity. Alex was certain Dominic was going to send his corporate lawyers to take the baby. He needed to pack. He needed to run. But he had nowhere to go and absolutely zero money. Suddenly, heavy, aggressive footsteps echoed in the hallway. A loud, violent pounding struck the door, rattling the cheap hinges. "Finch, open up!" It was Sullivan, the building's landlord, an unbonded, crude alpha who always looked at Alex with hungry, predatory eyes. "I know you're in there, you little freak!" Sullivan slurred, his heavy fists slamming against the wood. "Rent was due 2 days ago, and man, you smell absolutely delicious right now. Maybe we can work out a different kind of payment arrangement." Alex whimpered, crawling backward toward the mattress, looking around frantically for a weapon. He grabbed a rusted pipe from beneath the radiator, his heart hammering against his ribs. The door began to splinter as Sullivan kicked it. "Come on, Omega. Open the door before I break it down." Dominic sat in the back of the Maybach, his laptop glowing brightly in the dim interior. He had deployed Aegis Capital's entire cybersecurity division alongside Arthur's private investigators, effectively turning Manhattan into a massive surveillance grid. "Talk to me," Dominic barked into his Bluetooth earpiece. "We found a transaction, sir." The lead analyst's voice crackled. "A bodega in Queens, Hector's Market. He bought a bucket and damaged wholesale flowers at 5 a.m. this morning, using cash. The owner remembers him. Said he lives a few blocks away off Roosevelt Avenue. Send the address to my driver," Dominic commanded. "Now." The Maybach tore through the streets of Queens, ignoring red lights and speed limits. Dominic felt a sickening twist in his gut. The phantom bond, the connection he had tried to suppress for half a year, was suddenly blazing to life. It wasn't just aching anymore. It was screaming. Alex was in immediate, absolute danger. When the sleek black car skidded to a halt in front of the dilapidated brick tenement, Dominic didn't wait for his security detail. He kicked the door open and sprinted into the building, his alpha senses flaring. The stench of stale beer mold and garbage assaulted him, but beneath it, cutting through the filth like a beacon, was the desperate, terrified scent of his mate. Dominic took the stairs 3 at a time, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm. He reached the 3rd floor, just as a massive, sweating man in a stained tank top kicked entirely through a splintering apartment door. "Gotcha," Sullivan sneered, stepping into the dark apartment, reaching out toward the terrified Omega, backed into the corner. Dominic didn't think. He didn't issue a warning. He crossed the hallway like a thunderbolt, grabbing the back of Sullivan's collar. With a ferocious, terrifying display of raw alpha strength, Dominic hurled the larger man backward. Sullivan crashed through the hallway drywall, his head striking a structural beam with a sickening crack, rendering him instantly unconscious. Dominic stood in the doorway, his chest heaving, his eyes entirely black. The air in the tiny, freezing room became instantly saturated with the heavy protective scent of crushed cedar and ozone. Alex was pressed against the far wall, holding the rusted pipe in trembling hands, his face pale as a ghost. When he saw Dominic standing there, a massive, imposing silhouette against the hallway light, the pipe slipped from his fingers, clattering loudly onto the floor. "Alex!" Dominic breathed, his voice breaking. He stepped into the room, raising his hands, slowly showing he was unarmed. "It's me. You're safe." But the adrenaline crash was too severe. Alex let out a choked gasp, his knees buckling. He clutched his swollen belly, a sharp, agonizing cry tearing from his lips as a brutal contraction ripped through his body. "No, no, the baby," Alex sobbed, collapsing onto the stained mattress. Dominic was beside him in a fraction of a second, stripping off his custom charcoal wool coat and wrapping it tightly around Alex's freezing, trembling frame. He gathered the Omega gently into his arms, lifting him as if he weighed nothing. "Arthur!" Dominic roared into the hallway. "Get the car ready. Call Lenox Hill Hospital. Tell them to prep the private maternity wing immediately." The drive to Manhattan was a blur of flashing hazard lights and terrified whispers. Dominic sat in the back seat, holding Alex tightly against his chest, pressing his face into the crook of the Omega's neck, releasing calming, soothing pheromones. Alex clung to Dominic's shirt, crying out softly with every wave of pain, yet instinctively leaning into the warmth and scent of his true mate. Hours later, the sterile, bright lights of the private hospital suite felt like a different universe. Dr. Harrison, a top obstetrician, offered Dominic a reassuring smile. "The stress-induced premature contractions, but we've administered magnesium sulfate. The baby's heart rate is strong, and the contractions have stopped. He just needs severe bed rest, proper nutrition, and a stress-free environment." Dominic nodded, his face etched with exhaustion and profound relief. He quietly opened the door to the hospital room. Alex was lying in the massive bed, hooked up to an IV, looking tiny among the pristine white pillows. He was awake, his hazel eyes tracking Dominic as the Alpha approached the bedside. "Why are you doing this?" Alex whispered, his voice incredibly fragile. "Richard said you were disgusted by me, that I was just a biological inconvenience." Dominic closed his eyes, a tear escaping and tracking down his sharp jawline. He sat carefully on the edge of the bed and gently took Alex's bruised, scraped hand into his own, pressing a reverent kiss to the knuckles. "Richard is currently sitting in a federal holding cell," Dominic said softly, his voice trembling with emotion. "He forged your NDA. He stole the money. He lied to you, and he lied to me. He told me you took the payout and ran because you only wanted my wealth. Alex's breath hitched. You didn't hate me. Hate you. Dominic let out a wet, broken laugh, gently resting his forehead against Alex's. Alex, I have been half dead for 6 months. I walked around that glass tower, completely hollow, because my soul stayed in that hotel room with you. You are my mate, my true mate. And I swear on my life I will spend every second of every day making up for the pain you've endured. Alex looked into the deep, oceanic blue of Dominic's eyes. He saw no deception, no corporate ruthlessness, only pure, absolute devotion. The defensive walls Alex had built to survive the winter streets finally crumbled. He released a soft, yielding sigh, his inner Omega purring as the scent of cedar and thunderstorms enveloped him in perfect safety. Dominic, Alex whispered, tilting his head to the side, baring his vulnerable scent gland. It was an ancient, instinctual invitation. Dominic's eyes darkened with reverence. He leaned down, his lips brushing against the pulse point on Alex's neck. Are you sure forever? Forever, Alex breathed. Dominic's teeth elongated, and with a gentle, loving pressure, he bit down, claiming his mate. The bond snapped perfectly into place, a blinding rush of warmth, safety, and absolute certainty flooding both their minds. 6 months later, the penthouse at the plaza was no longer a cold, sterile environment. It was filled with the soft scent of vanilla white peach and baby powder. Dominic stood by the massive, floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out over Central Park, a gentle smile on his face. In his arms, wrapped in a cashmere blanket, was their healthy, perfect newborn son. Alex walked up behind him, entirely radiant, wrapping his arms around his alpha's waist. Dominic turned, pulling his husband into a deep, loving kiss, surrounded by everything he had ever truly needed. They had survived the winter, and now they owned the spring. Did Alex and Dominic's epic journey from heartbreak on the freezing streets of New York to finding their ultimate happy ending leave you entirely breathless? True love and fated mates always find a way to conquer the darkest of corporate lies and deceit. If you loved this emotional Omegaverse drama, please hit that like button, share this story with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more intense romantic audio dramas. Turn on notifications so you never miss out.